Your great-grandmother fed 8 people on 30 cents. 3 ingredients. No recipe card, no measuring cups, just knowledge passed down through kitchens that smelled like wood smoke and rendered lard. We threw that knowledge away when grocery stores started stocking everything. When convenience became the whole point, we forgot that the women who raised this country on bean soup and cornbread were not cooking poor. They were cooking smart. Number 17 on this list kept Depression-era families from going hungry for entire winters on less than $1. Number 8 was called peasant food for 200 years until a famous New York restaurant started charging $32 for it. And number 3 scientists now know contains more nutrition per penny than anything sitting in your pantry right now. These 30 meals were not failures. They were genius, and food companies needed you to forget them. Before we count down, hit subscribe. What you are about to learn might actually change the way you feed your family. Number 30, cornmeal mush, water, cornmeal, salt. That was it. Grandma stirred it slow in a heavy iron pot, dragging the wooden spoon through thickening yellow porridge until it pulled away clean from the sides. Poured into a loaf pan, cooled overnight, then sliced thick and fried in whatever grease was left from breakfast. The outside crisped gold. The inside stayed soft and dense, soaking up a drizzle of sorghum or cane syrup. In the rural South and Appalachian hollows of the 1930s, a pound of cornmeal cost 3 cents and fed a family of 5 for 2 days. Children who grew up on it remember the sound of that spoon scraping the pot, the smell of pan-toasted corn fat in the morning. Today we call it polenta and charge $15 a plate. Number 29, milk toast. Bread, milk, butter. 3 ingredients, 10 minutes, and a bowl of something that felt like a hug from the inside. Grandma tore thick slices of yesterday's bread into a bowl, poured hot milk over it, added a pat of butter, and called it supper when times were thin. It was the sick day meal, the widow's meal, the meal that showed up when the money ran out 3 days before payday. During the Depression, milk toast appeared on tables from Tennessee to Oregon. A meal so basic it embarrassed people to admit they ate it, but those people lived warm, full, and grateful. Number 28, fried green tomatoes. Green tomatoes, cornmeal grease. Before the movie made it charming, fried green tomatoes were a survival trick. Every garden had tomatoes that would not ripen before first frost. You did not waste them. You sliced them, dredged them through cornmeal, and fried them in a cast iron skillet with bacon drippings. The bitterness of the unripe fruit cut through the rich fat. The crust crackled. You ate them standing over the stove while the children set the table. This was not a recipe. It was a reflex. Number 27. Crackling cornbread, cornmeal, cracklings, water. When Grandma rendered lard from pork fat, the crispy bits left behind were cracklings. She did not throw them away. She folded them into cornbread batter. They added fat salt texture and a deep smoky richness that made plain cornbread taste like something altogether different. The cracklings puffed slightly in the oven heat, leaving little pockets of crunch in every slice. This was the original zero-waste cooking. Every part of the hog, every bit of grease, every crackling. Nothing left the kitchen without doing its job. Number 26. Dandelion greens with hot bacon dressing. Dandelion greens. Bacon fat vinegar. Tenant farmers in Pennsylvania and Ohio knew something your doctor just figured out. Dandelion greens are loaded with iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C. In early spring, when the root cellar was nearly empty, Grandma walked the yard with a knife and came back with enough greens to feed everyone. She wilted them with hot bacon fat poured directly from the skillet splashed in apple cider vinegar and put them on the table in 5 minutes. Free food. More nutrition per bite than anything in the grocery store. Modern nutritionists now call dandelion greens a superfood. Grandma just called them supper. Number 25, salt pork and beans, pinto beans, salt pork water. This was the meal that built the American South. A pot of pinto beans with a piece of salt pork dropped in at the start of the day would simmer low for 6 hours until the broth turned silky and the beans fell apart against a spoon. The salt pork gave everything it had, flavoring the entire pot for less than 8 cents in 1935. Served with cornbread to soak up the pot liquor, it was one of the most nutritionally complete meals a poor family could eat. Coal mining towns in Kentucky, sharecropper cabins in Mississippi, immigrant kitchens in Chicago. This pot was everywhere. Number 24. Vinegar pie. Egg sugar vinegar. This sounds like a mistake. It is not. When lemons were too expensive and fruit was out of season Depression era, grandmothers made pie from eggs, sugar, and apple cider vinegar. The vinegar created tartness that tasted uncannily like lemon curd. Baked in a pie shell, it set up custard smooth, bright, with acidity sweet enough to feel like a treat on a Sunday table where treats were rare. Vinegar pie appeared in the American South and Midwest throughout the 1930s and the 1940s. Families who were ashamed to serve it called it by other names. Families who were proud of it knew exactly what it was. It was 3-cent pie that tasted like something expensive. Number 23. Potato pancakes. Potatoes, flour, salt. Grandma grated raw potatoes straight into a bowl, squeezed out the starch water, mixed in a handful of flour and salt, and fried them flat in a hot pan. They came out crispy at the edges, tender in the center, with a savory potato flavor that needed nothing else. Eaten with applesauce if you had it, eaten plain if you did not. Either way, a pot of mashed potatoes nobody wanted became breakfast the next morning. This was the immigrant kitchen's answer to waste. Polish grandmothers, German grandmothers, and Jewish grandmothers called them lots and made them every Hanukkah. The same 3 ingredients, the same cast iron pan, the same genius. First pattern break. Here is what the food industry does not want you to know. In 1953, the Campbell Soup Company hired a team of home economists whose entire job was to convince American women that cooking from scratch was complicated, time-consuming, and inferior to opening a can. They published recipe booklets. They sponsored radio programs. They wrote columns in women's magazines under fake names. It worked. Within a decade, housewives who had been making potato pancakes and bean soup from 3 ingredients started buying cream of mushroom soup in cans and calling it cooking. The knowledge their mothers had died with them. The cans lived on. The beans and salt pork still cost less, still taste better. The industry just needed you to forget. Number 22. Hoover stew. Macaroni, canned tomatoes, hot dogs. Named after the president, nobody blamed nicely for the Depression. Hoover stew was what happened when you boiled macaroni, opened a can of tomatoes, sliced in some hot dogs if you had them, and let it all simmer together. It was not elegant. It was filling hot, and a child could make it alone. Relief kitchens across New York and Chicago served versions of this to thousands of families a day through the worst years of the 1930s. Children grew up eating it and remembered it as comfort rather than hardship because their mothers made it taste like something they chose to cook. Number 21. Pot liquor and cornbread. Collarded greens, fatback cornbread. The liquid left over from boiling greens with fatback is called pot liquor, and it is more nutritious than the greens themselves. Every vitamin that cooked out of the collards ended up in that dark, smoky broth. Grandma poured it into a bowl, crumbled cornbread on top, and called it pot liquor supper. Children lapped it with a spoon. Men came home from fieldwork and drank it from the bowl. It was considered the poorest meal in the South. Nutritionists now call it one of the most mineral-dense preparations in traditional American cooking. Grandma just called it not wasting good food. Number 20. Tomato gravy. Canned tomatoes, flour, bacon drippings. On mornings when the egg money ran out, Grandma made gravy. She cooked flour and bacon drippings until it turned golden, then poured in a can of stewed tomatoes and stirred until smooth and thick. It went over biscuits, over cornbread, over fried mush, over anything that needed something on top. Tangy, rich, and deeply savory. It tasted expensive on ingredients that cost almost nothing. Southern farmhouses kept a can of tomatoes in the pantry the way northern houses kept a box of crackers. Insurance against empty mornings. Number 19. Cornbread and buttermilk. Cornbread, buttermilk, salt. This is not a recipe, it is a meal. Cold buttermilk poured over crumbled cornbread in a tall glass, eaten with a long spoon. The cornbread absorbed the buttermilk and softened into something almost pudding-like, cool and slightly sour filling and strange. Farmers across the South and Midwest ate this for supper on hot summer evenings when nobody wanted to stand over a stove. Old men still alive today remember coming in from the fields, pouring buttermilk over yesterday's cornbread and eating standing at the kitchen counter. They grew up strong on it. Their grandchildren grew up on fast food and wonder why their bones hurt. Number 18. Bread pudding. Stale bread milk eggs. Every household produced stale bread. Grandma did not throw it away. She tore it into a baking dish, poured in warmed milk, beaten eggs, and a shake of cinnamon or nutmeg if she had it, then baked it until it puffed golden, and the whole house smelled like something much more expensive was in the oven. The edges crisped. The center stayed custardy. This was the Depression-era family's dessert, their Sunday treat, their way of turning yesterday's mistake into today's celebration. It is now a staple of upscale Southern restaurants, charging $12 a portion. Grandma would have something to say about that. Number 17. Dried apple stack cake. Dried apples, flour, lard. This is the meal and the recipe that kept Appalachian families fed through winter so cold the well froze solid. Apples were dried in summer and stored in cloth sacks in the root cellar. In winter, they were reconstituted and stewed into a thick spiced filling. Thin rounds of flour and lard pastry were baked like cookies, then stacked with the apple filling between each layer and pressed overnight until the whole thing slid together into a dense, sweet, portable cake. Wedding guests in the 1920s brought their layers as gifts. The bride's family stacked them. A 12-layer cake meant a popular bride. This cake required no refrigeration, no sugar beyond what the apples held, and no baking powder. It kept for 2 weeks. It fed everyone who came through the door. Salt pork flour grease sliced thin, rolled in flour, and fried until the fat crisped and the lean darkened. Eaten with gravy made from the pan drippings and a little water. Salt pork was cheaper than bacon, cheaper than ham, cheaper than almost any meat in the store. It was the everyday meat of tenant farmers, railroad workers, mill hands, and anyone who needed protein and could not afford to be selective. The pan gravy it left behind was thick, salty, rich, and went over biscuits, over grits, over anything that sat still long enough. This is where the term white gravy was born. Not from a recipe book. From a pan that could not be wasted. Second pattern break. The science nobody told your grandmother about. In 2017, researchers at the University of Georgia analyzed the nutritional profile of traditional Depression-era meals. Their findings were startling. Pinto beans cooked with salt pork and eaten with cornbread covered nearly all daily protein, fiber, iron, calcium, B vitamin, and caloric requirements for an adult male doing heavy labor for less than a dime a serving. The researchers noted that the traditional Southern diet of beans, greens, and cornbread was nutritionally superior to the processed convenience foods that replaced it in the 1950s and the 1960s. Superior. Grandma was not feeding her family poorly. She was feeding them right. We spent 50 years convincing ourselves otherwise and got sicker in the process. Number 15. Syrup sandwich. White bread, butter, cane syrup. Do not make a face. In the rural South during the Depression, sugar was expensive and rare. Cane syrup, sometimes called ribbon cane or sorghum, was cheap and local and sweet enough to turn a plain piece of bread into something a child would eat happily. Butter spread on white bread, a drizzle of thick amber syrup folded in half and handed to a child before school. That was breakfast. That was the lunch pail. That was the snack when there was nothing else. Women who grew up eating syrup sandwiches remember them with a tenderness that has nothing to do with the food itself. It was what their mothers had. It was given with love. That is the whole recipe. Number 14. Bean soup with ham hock. Navy beans, ham hock, water. 1 ham hock, $1. 1 pound of dried navy beans, 40 cents. Water, free. Grandma started this pot in the morning low and slow, and by evening the kitchen smelled like something had been cooking all day. Something serious, something worth coming home to. The beans swelled and softened and absorbed the smoky salt from the ham hock until every bite carried the ghost of pork, even though there was almost no actual meat in the pot. This fed 12 people. This was dinner and tomorrow's lunch. This was the immigrant's meal, the miner's meal, the Salders's widow's meal. Senate bean soup still served in the United States. Senate cafeteria is a direct descendant of this exact pot. They just do not say where it came from. Number 13. Egg drop soup. EGGS, broth salt. Before the Chinese restaurant on every corner, egg drop soup lived in American farmhouse kitchens. When you had broth from boiling a chicken carcass and not much else, you brought it to a simmer. You drizzled in beaten eggs and you watched them ribbon white and gold through the golden liquid. Salt done. A bowl of something hot and nourishing from almost nothing. European immigrant grandmothers called it stratella and added parmesan. Jewish grandmothers called it egg soup and served it for Shabbat. Southern grandmothers called it whatever they felt like and made it work. The ingredients were the same. The knowledge was the same. Potatoes, onions, gross. This was Tuesday night in 10,000 American households for 50 years. Cast iron skillet, layer of sliced potatoes, layer of sliced onions, generous spoonful of bacon drippings. Lid on, low heat. Patience. The potatoes caramelized against the iron. The onions turned sweet and golden salt and pepper at the table. Nothing else needed. It was a side dish that became a main dish when the main dish ran out. It was the meal that appeared on the Friday before payday when the money was gone, but the pantry still had a bag of potatoes and a string of onions hanging from the kitchen ceiling. Cheap, perfect, forgotten. Number 11. Crackers and milk. Saltine crackers, milk, salt. Old men in rural America remember this as clearly as they remember anything. A bowl, a handful of crackers crumbled into it. Cold milk poured over. A pinch of salt. Eaten with a spoon for supper. When supper was whatever you could scrape together. Simple to the point of embarrassment, but filling, and the crackers absorbed the milk the way cornbread did, going soft and slightly grainy in a way that satisfied something basic and animal in a hungry stomach. This was not failure. This was making do with what was in the cabinet at 9 o'clock at night when the stove had been cold for hours. Third pattern break. What the supermarket took away was not just a recipe. There is a woman alive today who is 91 years old and grew up in rural Georgia in the 1940s. She raised 7 children on a farm that grew its own corn and dried its own apples and kept 1 hog a year. She knew exactly how many meals she could get from a single ham hock. She knew that dandelion greens were free. She knew that dried beans cost less than anything else in the store and filled a belly longer than anything else on the menu. Her grandchildren do not know how to boil beans. They never learned. The knowledge stopped somewhere around 1965 when her daughter got a job in town and started buying canned soup. That is not progress. That is a generational theft so quiet nobody noticed it happening. Number 10. Wacky cake. Flour cocoa vinegar, also called depression cake or crazy cake. No eggs, no butter mode, no milk. During wartime rationing, when those ingredients were scarce, bakers discovered that a reaction between vinegar and baking soda could leaven a chocolate cake perfectly, and that vegetable shortening mixed into flour and cocoa could create the moisture eggs and butter usually provided. The result was a dark, dense, genuinely delicious chocolate cake that cost almost nothing. The chemistry worked because the vinegar activated the baking soda and created carbon dioxide bubbles that lifted the batter. You did not need to understand the chemistry. You needed to follow the recipe once and be amazed every single time it worked. Number 9. Milk gravy and biscuits. Flour milk grease. This is the holy trinity of Southern poverty food. Flour cooked in pan drippings until it turns into a golden paste. Hot milk stirred in until smooth, thick, and creamy, then poured over split biscuits made from those same 3 ingredients in slightly different proportions. Grandma could make this entire meal in 20 minutes with no refrigeration, no fresh vegetables, and nothing but pantry staples that kept all winter. It was breakfast on the coldest mornings. It was supper when the hens were not laying and the smokehouse was empty. It was proof that 3 ingredients managed correctly could produce something that tasted like abundance on a morning that felt like nothing but lack. Number 8. Pinto beans and cornbread. Pinto beans cornmeal fatback. This is the meal, the one that defines an entire region and an entire era and an entire way of feeding people who had almost nothing. Across Appalachia, across the rural South, across every coal camp and tobacco farm in Hill County in America, this pot was on somebody's stove every single day for 100 years. The beans simmered with fatback until they burst open and thickened their own broth. The cornbread came out of the oven crispy on the bottom, tender in the middle. You broke the cornbread into the beans and ate it with a spoon from a chipped bowl at a table with too many children and not enough chairs. Families who ate this lived long lives. Families who were ashamed of it got sick eating the things that replaced it. Number 7. Fried mush. Cornmeal mush grease syrup. This deserves its own entry separate from plain mush, because frying it changes everything. The previous night's mush chilled in a loaf pan until firm, sliced into half-inch slabs and fried in a cast-iron skillet until both sides formed a dark golden crust. The inside stayed soft. The outside crackled. Syrup drizzled on top melted into the cracks. This was the Depression breakfast that felt like pancakes. Children who had it every morning remember asking for it long after their families could afford something else. The crunch, the sweet syrup soaking in, the way the corn flavor deepened in the hot grease. A pound of cornmeal made breakfast for a family of 6 for 3 days straight. Nothing else came close to that economy. Number 6. Water pie. Water, flour, sugar. This sounds impossible. It is not. From the desperate bottom of the Depression, when there was nothing in the house and company was coming and pride demanded something be put on the table, grandmothers made water pie. A pie shell filled with a mixture of water, flour, sugar, butter, and vanilla baked until it set into a translucent, wobbly custard. Sweet, slightly gelatinous, completely honest about what it was. Nobody talked about it outside the family, but families who ate it knew. The woman who made something out of nothing, who put a pie on the table when there was no food in the house, who refused to serve an empty plate, she was the strongest person in the room. She always was. Number 5. Rice and gravy. Rice pan drippings water. The entire premise of Chun cooking Louisiana, working class cooking, and half the rural South for 200 years. White rice cooked until each grain was separate, topped with a thin gravy made from whatever drippings were left in the pan, stretched with water, and browned into something dark, savory, and rich. When there was no meat, the gravy was just the grease and the brown bits. When there was a little meat, the gravy carried it across the entire bowl. Rice was cheap. Rice was filling. Rice did not argue with you. And pan drippings were free because the pan was already dirty. This meal cost almost literally nothing and appeared on the tables of people who went on to live full, long, good lives. Number 4. Bean bread beans, cornmeal water. Cherokee grandmothers knew this before anyone else on this continent. Cooked pinto or October beans folded into cornmeal dough shaped into rounds and boiled or wrapped in corn husks and cooked over fire. The beans cooked into the cornmeal as it set, creating a nourishing bread that needed nothing else. No butter, no salt, no side dish. It was the whole meal during the removal. During the Depression, during the years when the federal government's commodity food programs brought white flour and lard and canned goods that were nutritionally empty. The grandmothers who remembered bean bread kept it alive. They were right. Everything they knew was right. Number 3, dried pea soup, dried split peas, ham bone, water, 1 ham bone from Sunday's dinner, a pound of dried split peas. Water. That is all. You simmer it for 3 hours, and what you get is something that medieval European peasants, American Depression survivors, and World War II homerant cooks all discovered independently. Split peas dissolve when cooked long enough. They thicken the water they sit in, and the ham bone perfumes the whole pot with a smoky depth that makes the final soup taste like it has 20 ingredients. Scientists measured the nutritional content of a bowl of split pea soup with ham bone in 2019. Complete protein from the pea grain combination. More dietary fiber per serving than almost any other food. B vitamins, iron, potassium, everything a body needs for a day of work in a bowl of soup that cost $14 in 1940. Number 2. Streen and greens. Fatback collarded greens pepper. Fatback is not bacon. It is the pure fat from the back of the hog salted and kept without smoking. Drop it into a pot of raw collard greens with water and black pepper. Bring to a boil, then reduce to a whisper and cook for 2 hours until the greens have collapsed and turned dark and have absorbed every bit of fat and salt that the fatback can give. What you end up with is one of the most intensely flavored dishes in American culinary history. The greens are bitter, salty, soft, and dark. The pot liquor is almost black. The fatback renders down to a sliver of itself. This is the dish that enslaved people cooked in the American South when they were given the parts of the hog nobody else wanted. They made it the foundation of a cuisine. It fed generations. It is still right now the most soulful thing you can make on a stove. Number 1, cornbread, milk, and onion. Cornbread, buttermilk, raw onion. This is not a recipe. This is memory itself. A wedge of hot cornbread, a glass of cold buttermilk, a raw onion sliced thin at the table. You eat the cornbread. You sip the buttermilk between bites. You take a bite of raw onion when you need it. Across the rural South, across Appalachia, across every part of America where poverty and pride lived together under the same roof. This was the meal that ended the day. The last thing eaten before sleep, the thing that was always there when nothing else was. The sharpness of the raw onion cut through the fat of the cornbread. The cold buttermilk settled the stomach. The whole combination, cheap, plain, and complete, did what all the best old meals did. It closed the day without complaint. It gave a tired body just enough comfort to sleep and just enough strength to wake up and do it all again in the morning. That was the real genius of these meals. Not glamour, not novelty, reliability. The women who served food like this were not improvising because they lacked intelligence. They were drawing from a system of knowledge so practical, so disciplined, and so exact that an empty pantry could still become supper. They knew what filled a stomach longest. They knew what could stretch across 2 meals instead of 1. They knew which scraps carried flavor, which greens carried strength, which starches carried a family from sundown to sunrise. They understood hunger the way modern marketers understand packaging. Intimately, professionally, without romance. And that is the part we keep getting wrong. We talk about these dishes like they came from deprivation alone, as if they were accidents. As if they were sad substitutes for the food people really wanted to eat. But these meals lasted for generations because they worked, because they tasted good, because they used every bit of what was available and turned necessity into tradition so completely that children grew up craving the very foods outsiders pitied. Try one this week, just one. Make the bean soup with a ham bone and see how far one pot really goes. Fry yesterday's mush in a hot skillet and listen to that first crackle when it hits the grease. Stir up milk gravy from drippings and flour and pour it over biscuits while it is still steaming. Then ask yourself honestly whether we improved anything by replacing all this with boxes, packets, powders, and meals that come with instructions longer than the ingredient list. These were not survival meals in the way people mean it now. They were systems. They were memory. They were women feeding more mouths than the money should have allowed, using less fuel, less waste, less fuss, and somehow more wisdom than most modern kitchens ever see. The food industry spent decades teaching us that convenience was progress. Maybe sometimes it was, but it also cost us texture, skill, patience, flavor, and the kind of knowledge that once lived in the hands of ordinary women and disappeared so quietly almost nobody noticed it was gone. So tell me in the comments, which one did your grandmother make? Which one did your great-grandmother swear by? Which meal still lives in somebody's kitchen in your family even now? I want to know what survived. I want to know what people still remember. Because if enough of us remember it, maybe this knowledge is not gone after all.